Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. We are going to get started shortly. So I thank those of you who are on the line with us and for your patience. We'll be back in about a minute or so to get things kicked off. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Meg Beyer, and I am part of the MCTAC team here at the McSilver Institute. I'm really thrilled today to be joined by two wonderful colleagues who will be presenting on key operational functions and executive leadership. This is the first of our four-part webinar series in business management best practices, and we're really thrilled to be delivering this to you today. So we are going to be delivering one webinar every other week for the next few weeks. Also, as part of this webinar series, we are doing a final office hours. So if you join us throughout the subsequent webinars and this one and have questions that pop up, not only do we encourage you to chat them in throughout the actual webinar, but we'll be having an office hours at the conclusion of the webinar series so that if questions pop up along the way, you can address them with our presenters in a few weeks at the end of everything. So again, I want to thank you for joining us and just run through a couple logistics for things today. So as you may know, if you've joined us for MCTAC webinars in the past, we are recording this webinar. We're going to post it to the MCTAC website so that you can find it if you want to re-listen to things or revisit things after the fact. We're also encouraging you today to chat in your questions that might pop up by using the chat box functionality, and that should be found on the right-hand side of your screen. And we're asking you to chat in to all panelists so that all the presenters today can see the questions that come in. What we'll be doing is saving time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions, but we don't want to have you hesitate or wait to chat your questions in until the end. We would encourage you to chat them in throughout the entire webinar. My colleague Kevin, who is our MCTAC host on the back end today, will be collecting these questions, and we'll run through them at the end of the webinar. So again, I want to thank you for joining us. And with that, I'm going to ask our presenter, Fern, to kick things off, introduce herself, and lead us through the webinar today.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're very excited about this, and I know that this is the beginning of a new training approach from MCTAC, and I hope that we can answer some of the questions that you might have. This is a Business 101 overview of business practices and operations. Some of this may be familiar to you, hopefully, I hope it'll be familiar, but some may be new or it may be organized in ways that are a little bit different from what you're used to. So we'll be focusing not only on developing and implementing a business plan, but also the relationship between program and business operations. So our agenda for today, we'll be talking about the role of leadership. We'll be discussing what is a business plan and what's the relationship between the business plan and the strategic plan. We'll be developing the importance of developing a business plan that reflects the agency mission and vision and culture will also be discussed. And we're going to talk a lot about communication, who needs to know and why. At the end of that discussion about leadership and the development of business planning, I'll be turning this over to Ro Belfini, who will be discussing workflows, internal controls, risk mitigation, efficiencies, which you see on this slide, will actually be discussed in our second webinar, which will be on March 18th. Just to briefly introduce myself to those of you who don't already know me, Fern Zagor, I was the CEO of the Staten Island Mental Health Society. Many of you are aware that the society successfully merged into and was acquired by Richmond University Medical Center on Staten Island and is now a division of the hospital. That merger took place, it was effective January 1st of 2019. In June of that year, at the end of June, I felt mission accomplished in terms of the merger, and it was time for me to move on. So I've moved into consulting, and I now have Fern Zager Consulting, LLC, and that's where I am now. So moving right along, when I pass this on to Ro, she'll introduce herself as well. Okay, so let's talk about the role of leadership. I think you know that leadership plays a key role in the operation of any organization. Leaders set the tone within an agency. They reflect the mission, vision, and values of the agency. And in that context, this leads to the development of the culture, which ultimately impacts effectiveness, compliance, and client and staff morale and motivation. So leadership in the nonprofit sector means facing challenges that are unique and different from the for-profit sector. We might take that for granted, but there's some key overlap, of course, but there are some significant differences. Leaders are charged with directing day-to-day operations, establishing goals and objectives, and building an internal organizational structure. That's a lot on the one leader who may be the CEO, but it's also distributed and shared with and delegated to other key leaders in the organization. Leaders must generate staff, board, and community stakeholder buy-in, and that's very critical to the role of a leader. And they must align their business and strategic plans with a fundraising plan reflecting the organization's mission and its needs for sustainability and for future growth. If we're going to survive, and we all know this, we've been through so much with so many changes on the state level, on the federal level, even on the local level that have been making so many demands, we have to be able to be flexible, and we have to have planning in a way that allows us to go with the flow, to make the changes that are necessary to reflect new demands, but still keeping our mission, vision, and values. Okay. So I'm going to briefly talk about certain leadership styles. This section by itself could probably take 1 or 2 or 3 webinars all on its own, because there's just so much to be said about the importance of leadership and the different leadership styles. But I thought that for the sake of this presentation, that it would be good to at least identify some of the key styles and give you an opportunity to reflect on what resonates with you, and give you some opportunity, again, to think about how you approach the various issues that we're going to be discussing. So according to a study of the nonprofit leadership in the U.S. and its impending crisis, this is an article by Adrian Sargent and Harriet Day that came out in 2018, they identified through a survey 4 types of leadership styles. And they are servant leadership, transformational leadership, charismatic leadership, transactional leadership, as you see on these slides. So let's delve into these a bit. Okay, hold on a moment. Yes. So the servant leader, and I might have chosen a different term. Again, it's coming from this article. That title of servant leader describes someone who is engaging, caring, and seeks satisfaction and buy-in from staff and other stakeholders. And we'll talk about the importance of stakeholders in a moment, but the servant leader, again, I would have found a slightly better term for it. The approach is not a top of the pyramid or a top-down approach. Servant leaders look to share power, desiring to put the needs of others first. They are motivated by the well-being of people, by creating value for communities, and by empowering others, especially subordinates, to grow and succeed. Their view is outside themselves. They're not narcissistic or power-hungry or controlling. They're really all about the community that they serve and the people who serve that community. In this survey, 53% identify themselves as servant leaders. Now we'll go on to the next one. Oops. There we go. Transformational leaders. This type of leader thinks beyond their own satisfaction and beyond just the buy-in of the stakeholders. Specifically, transformational leaders are often characterized by acting with high levels of morality, optimism, and confidence while moving towards the future, which you could say that about servant leaders as well. But they also walk the walk by both emphasizing and embodying values that are important to their internal colleagues as well as their external members and contributors. So they're looking at the whole picture. They're looking at what are the values that drive them, but also how are they connecting both internally, staff, board members, and externally with other stakeholders in their community. Transformational leaders are motivated by the nonprofit's vision and its ideal future. They are the dreamers that can envision what's possible and then bring it to life. They make sure the organization and its stakeholders understand not just what they are doing, but why they are doing it and how it's related to the nonprofit's mission. About 35% of the people who were surveyed said that they were transformational leaders. I suspect as I'm going through all of this, you're doing what I did when I first read through this and trying to see where I fit in. And it gets kind of tricky because there are elements of all of this that seem to apply. So let's look at the next. Charismatic leadership. Okay. I know we all think that we're charismatic. However, charismatic leadership, at least we hope that we're all charismatic, but the charismatic leadership has its pros and cons. Charismatic leaders rely on the strength of their personalities. So they focus on drumming up excitement and enthusiasm for a vision or goal. They motivate certain behaviors through force of personality or persuasion and are usually very effective communicators. Rather than pulling team members and contributors into the vision, these leaders use their own convictions and confidence to benefit the nonprofit's mission. So a lot of energy circulates around these charismatic leadership styles. And the charismatic leader is often looking for cues from the people that they are dealing with to see if they're being effective or impactful, because they're going to change their approach based on the feedback that they're getting. It's very much about the relationships that they're forming, that feedback, and being able to implement or share their vision and goals and convince or encourage people to follow their vision. Leaders who fall into this category often create higher levels of staff assurance and job satisfaction for team members, helping them to see that they're providing meaningful work. However, they can develop a high need for power, which can lead to narcissism and a tendency to exaggerate their own abilities. Again, it's all about the leader, or primarily about the leader. These types of leaders are known to take high risks, which can damage long-term sustainability. It could be good too, but you have to be aware that there could be that pitfall. These tendencies demonstrate why a strong surrounding team is important. Someone who's willing to say, the direction you're going in is not the right direction. I've often, I don't view myself specifically as a charismatic leader, but I'm always happy when my staff tells me that I'm wrong. For me, that has served a number of different values. One is they're feeling comfortable enough to speak up, which tells me my relationship with my staff is good. They care about the success of the organization, so they don't want me to be making mistakes, and they care about me because they don't want me to be making mistakes. So I love when staff speak up and push back, and again, tell me that I'm wrong. Always makes me feel good. So 30% of those surveyed identify themselves as charismatic leaders. And the next and the last is the transactional leader. This type of leader develops a culture of deliverables and rewards. These types of leaders find motivation through goal setting and achievement, not all that dissimilar to a commission-based sales executive. You get rewarded for what you accomplish. As defined, transactional leadership is a, quote, an exchange process based on the fulfillment of contractual obligations and is typically presented as setting objectives and monitoring and controlling outcomes. Some research argues that providing tangible rewards for individuals within the organization can motivate them to perform. Others have found that it can create an unhealthy level of organizational competitiveness. And I know many of our organizations have struggled with how do we reward expected or so-called good behavior. Productivity is up, client outcomes are good, client satisfaction is high. How does the organization effectively reward those individuals within our organization when they're performing well? And we know that some of the limitations, of course, have to do with finance and budget, but there also could be union issues that impact that and other personnel issues that will impact that as well. But it is something that 5.1% surveyed identify themselves as these types of transactional leaders. Okay, next. What I do want to say is that in reality, I think we all incorporate to one level or another all aspects of all four types of leadership styles. Of course, we will be more likely to reflect one over another depending on who we are. But when I think about myself and what I've done, I think that there's a bit of each of these styles in my style, and I'm glad for that. Although I would say there are dominant styles for each of us, and it's good to know. I see myself, and I hope it comes through, I see myself as a transactional leader, being able to identify with my staff and with leadership goals and directions and visions, and then come up with a plan together. But clearly knowing that the buck stops here as a CEO and that I have ultimate responsibility and that I'm helping to steer the ship and at times taking over the steering wheel and steering it myself when that's necessary. So that leads us into leadership and business planning. So regardless of your style, nonprofit leaders need high-level organization and technological vision to achieve their nonprofit's goals and vision. Understanding the style of how each leader operates, as well as what type of team they need to be surrounded by, can help determine how they should manage time and resources and how their style is impacting the nonprofit organization. One of the key tools to help move this along is developing a business plan. So, what's a business plan? A business plan is a written document that describes in detail how a business is going to achieve its goals. It lays out a written plan from a need, program, marketing, financial, and operational viewpoint. It lays out a plan of operation that identifies how an organization will reach its goals and objectives. It's flexible, and we have to remember it should change as the organization matures, which means the need to periodically look at it and revise. And of course, the revisions are really needed when you're bringing on new programs or you're redesigning your staff and operations, if you're bringing on new leaders or new staff. We're always going back to vision, mission, and values, and then our business plan to make sure all that we're doing is reflected and supported and aligns with these. In the healthcare sector, the plan should align with a triple aim. Very key for us, to improve patient care experience, improve the health of patient populations, and reduce the per capita cost of health care. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Here we go. So I'm often asked, what's the difference between a business plan or a strategic plan, and do we need both? And there's often confusion about that. They're similar, but they're different, and they're related to each other. So yes, we absolutely need both. The business plan, it's an action plan. It identifies the tasks, the milestones, and goals, and the potential for success and potential risks. It really reflects goals, mission, and what drives us in the work that we do. It explains who are the nonprofit customers, what is the geographic area that we're serving, what services are unique to us. It helps each organization get a real good picture for itself of what their value is in the community, who they are offering this value to, what changes they're hoping to address, or what gaps or needs they're hoping to address, and how they're going to do that. Different from a strategic plan, the strategic plan takes what the business plan has identified and answers more specifically how the desired results will be achieved. Examples, how will goals be accomplished with limited resources? So you have your goals, that's identified in the business plan, but what are you going to do? How are you going to accomplish these goals? How are you going to identify your objectives and measure those accomplishments? What will be prioritized? Especially when you have limited resources, and maybe you have a plan in your business plan where you want to accomplish a lot, but you can't do it all at once. So how are you going to triage and prioritize? Which means, what needs to happen and when to achieve success. And specifically, and very important, is how will success be measured? By the way, I've just completed writing some RFPs, some proposals for federal grants, and they are all about, in those proposals, identifying goals, which are the more blanket concerns, that the business plan addresses, and then identifying objectives that are time-limited, distinct, that have measurable outcomes. Extremely important to be able to do that. And most grantors are requiring that. Go to the next slide. So let's talk briefly about the elements of a business plan. I've gotten some requests for a template. I have to say that there's no single type of template. If you Google business plans for not-for-profits, you'll find dozens of formats. And in some of them, they have a format, and for minimal cost and sometimes for none, they'll ask you questions, you fill it in, they'll plop it into their format, and out will come a business plan. But in my experience, that kind of a template isn't personalized enough, to your organization and what you need. You could probably tweak it if you want to, but at minimum, any business plan, if you're creating it yourself or you're using a template, has certain elements. Again, it's a single document. It could be 1 page or more. It has an executive summary, and that executive summary, it includes an overview of the agency, its description, its mission, unique strengths, assets, service, leadership, services provided, leadership, location, what makes it special. And it's usually just 1 page, and sometimes you can use that 1-pager by itself, depending on who you are pitching your organization to or who you are trying to explain what it is that you do and what it is that you hope to accomplish. So it's good to get that all into 1 page. But the business plan, to be most effective, should expand on all these areas. So you have your executive summary. You also have a needs assessment. You want to discuss why your services are important. You want to identify gaps, needs, and opportunities. This both shows your value to your target audience and your community. It shows that you are aware of what the community needs. Even if you don't currently provide those services, they're not available in your community. And it can set the stage for future growth and future asks. Getting that down in one place helps keep the future always in mind, both for you, your staff, your stakeholders, and others that you might be reaching out to. Gets them to think about the future on behalf of you and your organization. In your business plan, as a result of the needs assessment, and these things flow one right into the other, you begin to look at funding and a marketing strategy. How will your services be funded? How does it fit into your business plan? And who will know about what you're doing, about your business plan, and how are you going to let them go? And of course, there needs to be an acknowledgement, a reflection of your budget. It doesn't have to be tremendously detailed. You can talk about your global budget, and it's a $20 million organization that provides yada, yada, yada. We want to increase by adding a different program, which would cost us another $500,000. You can develop the budget in different ways. What you would like to do, if you can, is to differentiate between the amounts of dollars that are going towards administrative overhead and the amount of dollars that are going directly to service provision. Funders like to see that, and they really want to know that most of your dollars are going towards the provision of services. And it's good to get that in the business plan. And if you're setting a target of 90%, 85%, 95% going to direct services, you want to make sure that you're keeping on that target as well as you look at your administrative and financial functions. Okay, and as I said, your business plan must always reflect your mission, vision, and culture. You hear me say that over and over again. So who needs to know? This is all about our stakeholders. You don't necessarily need to send this out to everyone, as I said, but you should be able to articulate your plan, like the 3-minute elevator speech, or the way you talk about your mission. You should have it pretty much standard. This is my agency. This is our mission. This is what we do. You should be able to produce your business plan upon request, either as that 1-pager in the executive summary, or there are others who are going to be a little bit more demanding and want to delve in a little bit more specifically, in more detail. And so then you have a full business plan that you can share with them. Depending on your leadership style and your team, there are decisions made about how to disseminate this info to your staff, the board, and other stakeholders. And remember that when folks want to know something and there are gaps in their knowledge, this is extremely important. It's a lesson I've learned over time. Whatever you don't say directly or whatever you don't have in writing, people are going to fill in the holes. So that whatever you don't provide them, they're going to provide their own information. They're going to make assumptions. Rumors start, especially at times when the organization is stressed or going under changes, new programs, having to add programs, drop programs, funding has changed, leadership has changed. People will fill the gaps, and they are rarely right. So you always want to get ahead of rumors. You want to get ahead of people coming up with their own answers. And if you see and if you hear that, and I'm sure you've all been through this, that there are all sorts of rumors that are flying around your agency or in the community. Sometimes these reach the legislators, Sometimes it reaches the media, your local newspapers, others. You really want to get ahead of it or address it immediately. Going back to your business plan can help you do that. Again, mission, vision, values, your culture, your business plan. Those become the hallmarks and the foundation of what you're doing. So who needs to know? Well, your executive leadership, often called a C-suite or something of that sort, your program directors and managers, all your agency departments, your board members, your program staff, grantors, legislators, local governments, regulators. I should have put in media here, your stakeholders. These are people who might need to know at any given time. You might not need to share this with them, all of them, certainly not at the same time, but these are people who are likely to need to know. So the question becomes, why? Well, I strongly encourage transparency. Every leader handles this differently. And I'm going to give you some examples. So every stakeholder has skin in the game in one way or another. Your clients have skin in the game. Your staff has skin in the game. The community residents do too. And your success is measured against deliverables, expectations, outcomes. Are we really making a difference? The board has fiduciary responsibility, so they need to know, and they have a right to know. And they're going to be held legally responsible whether they know it or not. So the more they know, the better. Funders want to know what they are paying for and what outcomes to expect. This is called return on investment, or ROI. And staff needs to know what they are doing and why, and what are the expectations. Transparency and communication from our senior leaders to increase staff buy-in and decrease resistance to change is the best approach, in my view, towards bringing the staff together as we move towards change. And the example I want to give you is kind of extreme, but I think it reflects the importance of communication and transparency. As I mentioned earlier, my agency, the Staten Island Mental Health Society, was acquired by and merged into Richmond University Medical Center. Now, this came about over a period of time, and as you can imagine, it was a very difficult change. But I learned about our financial situation when I first became CEO, which was in August of 2012. And at that time, in September, we had our auditor there, and the auditor said, "Fern, you're not going to make payroll in 2 months." That was pretty shocking. Had no expectation of that at all. and had to think very quickly about, at that moment in time, how do I save the agency? And it became more than a, how do I save the agency? It became, how do we save the agency? And how do I share this with staff? Well, of course, I reached out to the board immediately, but we also had an annual town hall meeting of staff every October. And there was a lot of enthusiasm about my coming in. I had been in the agency before as a COO, and so I had a lot of relationships there. And I came in and I said, folks, I have good news and bad news. The good news is I'm thrilled to be here, and I know this agency will continue to provide wonderful services, high-quality services to the children and families of Staten Island. The bad news is I've just been told by our auditor that we are at risk of not making payroll in 2 months, and we're going to have to take some drastic action. So you can imagine there was a big gasp in the room, but I took it further. I had created a very detailed PowerPoint that showed how we got to where we are, what our current financial situation is, and then proposed some steps to be taken over the next several months to try to get a handle on it. And that included being very upfront, saying that there will be layoffs, and we haven't decided where the layoffs would be or how many, but that would happen. Well, I was very anxious about this, and I didn't know how the staff would react. Transparency was not what they were used to. My predecessor felt the way many, particularly charismatic leaders feel, that the responsibility of the operations and administration of the agency belongs to the leadership and administration, and program delivery belongs to the program staff. Sorry, there's some background noise here. And so the staff really never understood their budget, never understood how what they were doing was impacting the life of the organization. This was really the first time they saw in detail what the budget looked like and what its relationship was to service delivery. Well, I have to say, as I said, I was kind of anxious about presenting all of this. They stood up and clapped. They thanked me for being so transparent, for helping them to understand what is really going on within the agency, and they pledged their support regardless of what would happen in the future, as long as the efforts were towards saving the programs and services for the community. That was a seminal moment in my leadership and in the course of the agency. And although the merger took more than 5 years, close to 7 from that point, the staff were entirely behind the process, even if they didn't like it all the time, but they understood it. And the keeping everything transparent and keeping people up to date became the culture. It was a new culture, changed the culture, became the culture of the agency. So again, I strongly encourage transparency. And by the way, given what our fiscal situation was, I did not hide this from the city or the state. I was very direct with them. And again, to my great pleasure, the city and the state leadership, DOHMH, OMH, OASAS, rallied behind us to help us through a very difficult time and to support the merger as we move forward. Again, key lesson here was transparency and developing from that point a business plan that made sense for where we were at that moment and where we were going. So it takes us into coordinating the plan. The business plan should be coordinated, as we've said, with not only the people, but the areas of program operations, service. It should be coordinated with service outcome expectations. They all have to be tied into the plan and the goals, staff performance expectations, client satisfaction, compliance issues, what we need to know, tracking outcomes, client, staff, and financial outcomes, return on investment, how are we really making a difference, is funding well spent, and the financial status. Are we spending within our budget and accomplishing what we planned? And to do this, we need a workflow and how that works to aid us. And for that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Ro Belfini. Ro, can you introduce and then move into the next slides?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Marie Belfini. I was the Chief Administrative Officer for Mental Health Society, and I with throughout the whole merger process. I'll be briefly talking to you about the workflow and what it means and what it does provide. As you can see from the slide, the workflow is a sequence of tasks that occur from start to finish. It can involve multiple individuals, departments, or it's a tool that should provide the who, what, where, why, when, and how function you are describing. A workflow can be very high level or it can be very detailed. Both are good, but when you talk about the benefits of a detailed workflow, you have to think about the fact that whatever input you're putting into the workflow or whoever's doing the input, it's transformed to an output. So you start with something is fed, something transformed, and what's the expectation at the end? There are various workflows that should be developed in an organization to document client, service, operation, and financial processes and perspectives. Completed workflows can facilitate the development of policies and procedure. That's policies and procedures for administrative or operational and clinical practices. Job descriptions. What does a receptionist do? What is the goal of that receptionist? How does that receptionist feed into, let's say, a claim or a bill, an invoice? These are the things that you're going to be describing in a workflow. The interdepartmental and community relationships. If you have a function or a program that has community involvement or other organizations are involved, these are things that need to be outlined in a workflow. Who are you communicating with? For example, if you develop a workflow, you're continually going to be looking at that workflow, and you're going to be employees. Where is that workflow? Is it true what we have outlined, or have changes been made? And how do we incorporate those changes in automation and compliance into a workflow? Where do we need audit trails in order to ensure that we're in compliance with regulations? Okay, so going on from there, this is very brief, high-level review. We will be going in more detail on March 18th. So workflows from a client perspective and client tracking. Understanding the initial and ongoing experience of a client is a key part of the service you provide, goals/outcomes you intend to reach. The workflow you develop should at minimum answer the following questions. Who is the client's initial contact? How long is the admission process? Who will evaluate the client to determine the appropriate service? Does the client require financial assistance? How does the medical record and documentation relate to the billing process? What safeguards, checks, and balances are built into the entire process? How do you identify waste, fraud, and abuse? For example, the tracer methodology, what an auditor comes in and does is they'll take a select number of clients, and they will actually trace the experience of that client. What I mean by every face-to-face, who they've met with, what programs they were associated with, this and the documentation that's involved with that client. So this is very, very important to have, to be able to document and to have an audit trail for all these things so that when an auditor comes in, you have confidence that that auditor is going to be pleased with what he sees, what kind of documentation he sees. Okay, going forward, I'm going to be very quick. In summary, today we've reviewed the role of leadership and leadership styles, the development and use of business plans, relationship between the business plan and the strategic plan, communication and coordination of the business plan with stakeholders internally and externally, the importance of developing a workflow. In our next session, we'll focus on finance, billing, administrative, and audit functions, and that will take place on March 18th.
Okay, so I think we're done with our presentation, and we're open for questions.
Thank you so much, both Ro and Fern, for leading us through the webinar today. This is Meg again from MCTAC. I am going to ask anyone who might have any questions to go right ahead and use that chat box functionality on the right-hand side of your screen and chat them in. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to chat in your questions, we'll be back shortly to respond to them. Okay, so we have a couple questions that have come in. One of the questions is, will the PowerPoint deck be shared? So yes, the PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar actually are going to be shared on the MCTAC website. So stay tuned, that'll be posted shortly. I know it takes about, I think 24 hours for our webinar system to download the recording. So that'll be shared with you shortly. All right, and now I'm going to read through some questions, Ro and Fern, and if you want to dive in and lend your expertise to the answers, it would be most appreciated. So here's the first one. How does quality care match with good business leadership?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. You know, leaders, regardless of what type of leader you are, whether you're more, whether you lean towards being the servant leader or the transformational leader or whatever sort, at the end of the day, we're looking to be able to accomplish the things that we had chosen to or determined to accomplish. You know, those are the goals. Those are reflected in your business plan, and then you drill down to a strategic plan, so that would be the next step of how you're going to make that happen. That immediately addresses what staff will be doing, quality of care, corporate compliance, so they all tie one into the other. It's really the leadership that needs to set that in motion, make clear to staff how important those functions are, and set up in workflows, and as Ro has talked about, how you're going to be checking in. Those are the checks and balances. How are you going to be checking in to make sure that what you say you're doing, you are actually doing? That does flow from the leadership down. So I hope I answered that question.
Thanks, Fern. I'm just going to dive right into the next question that came in. So this is another one of those like great questions, and it might take a second. So how do you balance serving clients and managing staff as a manager in a nonprofit organization?
I don't know that they're mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You know, I think we all know, I hope we all know, that when staff are satisfied, when they are well supported, well trained, held to certain standards, and acknowledged for their competence, expertise, caring, that now translates to the clients. The clients know that they're not just another Medicaid number or person on a case on your your among your cases, that they are important to the clinicians. So you're working on all of that together. Both staff, and I had it in my slides, both staff and client satisfaction are very important. If you don't see both, then something's not right. And you need to go back and look at what is happening within your organization. If there's a mismatch, a misalignment, expectations are not reflective of what client needs are or community needs are, adjustments have to be made. And you can really only know that by getting feedback. Many organizations and many funders require doing some sort of surveys, client satisfaction surveys for sure, focus groups, other ways of getting those feedbacks, advisory committees of clients.
In addition, Fern,
yeah.
I think this also rings true to what you said in the very beginning about transparency. If you have a staff, they need to know that they are part of the organization. They're part of the mission. They have the skin in the game, as you say. So once an employee, no matter who that employee is, if they are part of the mission, then you're managing your staff. And they are part of the organization and the mission. And that's through transparency as well.
Right. And just to follow up to Rose's point, sometimes we take for granted that the staff really understand the mission, vision, goals, and culture. That's not always the case. Oftentimes, staff are brought on, and they don't have a sense of where they belong in terms of the overall organization, particularly in larger organizations with several programs or divisions, but in smaller ones too. There's an assumption that they are part of our family and they'll figure out how this family functions. That's usually not the best way to onboard new staff or to keep supporting them throughout their stay with you. So orientations, and then supervision and periodic check-ins, and then the other things that I've said in terms of transparency and surveys and focus groups, knowing what the experience is from the client's point of view, which, by the way, is what the tracer methodology is all about. What is the client experience in your agency from the client's point of view?
Great. So kind of along those lines, just tying into that, I think someone is looking for some thoughts and suggestions on how to get feedback at an organization without turning it into a grievance session or an airing of grievances session.
Right. Well, there are all different ways of doing that, and that's always a concern. You don't want to open up Pandora's box. Who knows what's going to be coming out and how you're going to be able to deal with that. And some of that is reflective of what the culture is. I think that as leaders, you want your staff to know that you're a good listener and that you take what they say seriously. It doesn't mean that you're going to respond to everything that they say, or that you're going to be able to correct everything they want corrected, or that all that they want changed should be changed. But certainly being upfront about where you are and why decisions are made, for the most part, being just sharing why you're making the decisions that you're making, providing some sort of a rationale. And you don't have to dive into the weeds on that. You don't have to go through everything, but putting it into some perspective that people can understand so they don't feel discounted or disrespected. Some agencies have set up, many agencies have set up complaint boxes separately, and of course there are unions that people go to, but that's really not what you're addressing, nor am I. It really has to do with the relationship between the leadership, and that's not only the CEO. That has to do with division leaders, program directors and managers, the kind of communication that's encouraged, and that's the culture that's encouraged. When people know that their complaints are taken seriously, it rarely turns, it can, but it rarely turns into grievance sessions. And you also ask the questions in such a way that asks people to not only give complaints, but to also give solutions. You want them to think about what it is that they can do to make things better, or to meet expectations, or to meet regulators' requirements, or whatever the issues might be. The buy-in is key.
Thank you for that. Ro, did you have anything before I jump to the next question?
No.
Okay. So another participant asked us if either of you had any feedback regarding workflows and high turnaround or turnovers, I think. Any thoughts on that?
Ro, you're going to take
that?
Go
ahead, Fern. No, go ahead, Fern.
Okay. Well, I think that workflow and the kinds of things that you're going to be learning about in the next webinar, which will be focusing on data collection and IT and related issues, and that what we'll be presenting in our last session on the 18th, we'll dive into that a little bit more. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question one more time? I just want to make sure that I'm answering it.
I think someone was wondering if you had any thoughts or feedback or suggestions with workflows as it relates to an organization that might have a high turnover rate with staff.
Okay. So turnover rate can be reflective of very many things, and workflow is only one of them. So you do want to look at the kind of expectations that you have. And again, we keep going back to the leadership's role in being able to develop loyalty to the mission and goals and the values of the agency, and having infused throughout everything that you do why the agency is important, and why the work that the staff is doing is important. If you have a high level of turnover, then you have to ask why. You know, what's going on? Is this just typical turnover? Is it, like we had a situation where we were losing a lot of very good staff. Why? Because the Department of Education was paying salaries that were almost twice as high. We couldn't compete. So it wasn't because of anything that we were doing. In fact, many people had been there for a very long time and were very unhappy about leaving. But how could they say no to something, you know, to an organization that can pay them significantly more, and they have better work hours and more holidays and better benefits? So that was one reason for turnover, but there may be others. So if you're seeing a pattern, you have to explore and be open to accepting that things may not be right, and you as leaders may have to make some changes, and sometimes significant changes. If you're also seeing, you know, I'm going to say things that you know, if you're seeing turnover in one division more than in another, then you have to look at what's going on in that program or that division. Do things need to change? You know, so there are many different ways of looking at turnover.
I appreciate that. So I think with that, we are at the end of time for our webinar today. So I want to thank you both, Fern and Ro, for everything you shared. I want to thank everyone who joined as an attendee today. And we are, for those questions that we didn't get to today, we've collected them all. So we'll either address them at a future webinar or perhaps during the office hours at the end of the series. So thanks again for everyone for joining. We'll be posting the slides and the recording to the MCTAC website soon. And please join us for our next series, our next webinar in this series, which is happening in 2 weeks. So visit the MCTAC website for more. And thanks for joining us today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meg. Meg, should we stay on the line or not?